This video includes 22 graphs that tell a number of stories about Minnesota school districts. The topics include enrollment trends, test scores, revenues, and staffing levels. Graphs 1 and 2. This file includes 22 graphs that tell a number of stories about Minnesota school districts. The topics include enrollment trends, test scores, revenues, and staffing levels. We'll start with the number 194 in the yellow cell toward the upper left, which gives us the graphs for Lakeville District number 192. But whenever we want, we can change the district number to make comparisons. Now, here's an overview of all 22 graphs. Graph 1 shows the designated districts' enrollments between 2003 and 2026. The red bars show white enrollment, the black bars show non-white enrollment, and the combined bars show total enrollment. It turns out that in Lakeville, just like the state as a whole, enrollment is down for white students but up for non-white students. Total enrollment in Lakeville has shown an upward trend since about the year 2015. Now, Graph 2 shows Lakeville's enrollments by major ethnic group. Enrollment is down for white students, as we already said, but higher for students who are Black, Hispanic, or Asian. Now, to get the trends for the state as a whole, we're going to replace that number 194 with a state code 9999. Again, enrollment is down for white students, but up for the other groups. Now, for a district that does not have these statewide trends, let's look at Minneapolis, which has a code number of 1.2. In Minneapolis, white enrollment has been pretty constant actually, but other groups have actually been dropping. This is because so many non-white residents of Minneapolis have been moving to charter schools or open enrolling to other school districts. However, overall enrollment in Minneapolis seems to have stabilized over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, let's shift back to Lakeville. Graphs 3 and 4. Graph 3 shows the non-white portion of enrollment in Lakeville between 2003 and 2016. The black line shows the non-white portion for Lakeville each year. The red line shows the corresponding portions for the state as a whole. Note that for Lakeville, the non-white portion has risen sharply from about 5% to about 35%. For the state as a whole, the non-white portion has also increased and has now reached more than 40%. But also note that the gap between Lakeville and the state as a whole has recently been narrowing when it comes to non-white portions of enrollment. Graph 4 is very similar to Graph 3, only instead of looking at non-white portions of students, it's looking at low-income portions of students. And for both non-white and low-income students, the portion in Lakeville is quite a bit lower than the state total. Graphs 5 and 6 are similar to the last two graphs, except for Graph 5, we look at the limited English portions of Lakeville and statewide enrollment, and for Graph 6, we look at the special education portions. Graphs 7 and 8. Graph 7 is a scatter plot where each dot represents a specific school district. The big red dot, in this case, represents Lakeville. Positions of the dots from left to right show districts' limited English portions. Positions from top to bottom show districts' low-income portions. Note that every district with a high portion with limited English also has a high portion with low income. Not so surprising. Lakeville's big red dot shows that both its poverty portion and its limited English portion are below the state average. Now, for comparison, let's see where we would find the big red dot for Minneapolis. So you'll enter that 1.2 code again. And what we see here is that Minneapolis is above average in both low English portion and low income portion. Now, graph 8 is a little bit different. It shows a district's projected enrollment for the years from 2027 to 2036 based on two assumptions. First, that pre-kindergarten and regular kindergarten enrollments don't change after 2026. And second, cohort survival ratios, like the ratio of second graders in 2026 to first graders in 2025, also don't change. If you'd like a more thorough enrollment projection based on several years of data, we can help you with that. Graphs 9 and 10. Graph 9 shows MCA math proficiency for 2018 to 2025 for both Lakeville, which is shown in black, and the state as a whole, shown in red. Proficiency is based on all students and on the combined result across grade levels. Note that the MCA test wasn't administered in 2020 because of COVID. Also note that math proficiency dropped a large amount between 2019 and 2021 for the state as a whole and for most individual school districts. Graph 10 is similar to graph 9, but it's based on the MCA reading results rather than math. In both math and reading, Lakeville beats the state as a whole. Graphs 11 and 12. Graphs 11 and 12 show proficiency gaps in math and reading within the Lakeville School District, between students from lower income families and those from families with higher incomes. Gaps within districts tend to be similar to the gaps that apply to the state as a whole. Now let's take a look at those statewide gaps. This is not good news. We've been striving mightily to get these gaps to close, and over time, they simply have not been closing. We need to work on this. But I think I can find at least one example where there is some good news. This is Eden Prairie, and if you look between the years of 2008 and 2011, and you look at graph 12, which is reading, you see that the achievement level for the lower income students was on an upward trend. I just wish that that had continued. Graphs 13 and 14. Graph 13 is another scatter plot with every dot representing a school district and the big red dot representing Lakeville. This scatter plot compares poverty to proficiency on the MCA math test. Districts further to the right have higher poverty. Districts higher on the graph have higher math proficiency when we include all students in all grades. Note that the cloud of dots tends to move from upper left to lower right. This demonstrates something that we already know, that higher poverty correlates with lower proficiency. But here's something essential. Despite this correlation, within any narrow range of poverty, there is significant variation in proficiency. This demonstrates that some districts beat expectations. We should try to follow their example. Graph 14 is similar to graph 13, but it's based on reading rather than math. Graphs 15 and 16. Graph 15 shows full-time equivalent staff members for Lakeville's licensed staff for the years 2020 to 2025, with each year's bar separated into 4 parts based on the 4 major assignment codes of licensed staff. Note that teachers are far and away the biggest of these 4 categories. Graph 16 compares Lakeville's non-white portion of students to its non-white portion of licensed staff. In Lakeville, and in almost every other district, the non-white portion of students is far higher than the non-white portion of staff. Now let's check the non-white portions of students and staffs for the state as a whole. The difference here is a real concern. Looking at graph 16, it seems that we really should recruit more minority teachers. Graph 17 shows the 2026 relationship between districts' poverty levels and their overall general revenues per student. Districts further to the right have higher poverty. Districts higher on the graph have more general revenue per student. Again, the big red dot represents Lakeville. This time the cloud of dots tends to move from lower left to upper right. This demonstrates that higher poverty correlates with higher revenue, which makes sense because higher poverty increases compensatory revenue. Graph 18 shows two things. First, basic skills revenue per student based on poverty and limited English, and second, referendum revenue per student based on voter approval. Note that Lakeville doesn't have a lot of basic skills revenue because it has relatively low poverty and limited English. However, voters have given Lakeville above average referendum revenue per student. For comparison, let's look at Minneapolis. Graph 17 shows that in Minneapolis, overall general revenue per student is high. Graph 18 shows that this is based on both high basic skills revenue and high referendum revenue. We'll leave Minneapolis in place when we go to the next two graphs. Graphs 19 and 20. Graph 19 shows two kinds of student counts for the designated district, which in this case is still Minneapolis. First, the black bar shows the number of students coming in from other districts through open enrollment, and the red bar shows the number of students leaving Minneapolis either through open enrollment to other districts or movement to charter schools. Minneapolis gains far fewer students from other districts than it loses to other districts and charter schools. We've already discussed this, but the graph makes things really clear. But here's something that may not be so clear to citizens. When a district serves non-residents, this increases both state aid and local property taxes. Conversely, when a district's residents are served outside the district, this decreases both aids and levies. Graph 20 is a scatter plot that compares the 2026 ratio of students served to resident students and the corresponding impact of student movements on property taxes. Note that essentially all the districts that gain more students than they lose, in other words, are further to the right on graph 20, have higher property taxes as a result. In Minneapolis, the loss of students reduces property taxes by about $100 for each $100,000 of the tax base. This means that the tax on a $500,000 house in Minneapolis is reduced through open enrollment in charter schools by about $500. Let's compare that to a district in an opposite situation, Minnetonka, which gains thousands of students through open enrollment. In Minnetonka, those added students cause the property tax on a $500,000 house to rise by more than $500. And here's what's been happening in Lakeville, where the movements of students in and out are very roughly similar. Those movements do not have much of an impact at all on the tax rates. Graphs 21 and 22. Graph 21 shows Lakeville's general revenues per student between 2003 and 2026. These revenues per student are shown two ways. The black line in graph 21 shows the revenues per student before you adjust for inflation, and the red line shows the same revenues per student after we adjust for inflation using something called the implicit price deflator. The implicit price deflator, or IPD, is similar to the consumer price index, but it focuses more on the things that are actually bought by school districts. For many districts, the revenue per student after adjusting for inflation has been pretty constant. In Lakeville, inflation-adjusted revenue per student has increased, but not by so much. Has it increased enough? Graph 22 covers the same years and shows corresponding changes in poverty and limited English. It puts those revenues per student into a broader context. In Lakeville, like in most districts, poverty and limited English have increased by quite a bit. Has funding, as shown in graph 21, kept pace with the growing need? We will leave that essential question for you to answer.